Watching Russia's Victory Day parade this weekend, you might think that that country is as powerful as it ever was. But in fact, this year's parade was dramatically scaled back from years past. The event commemorating the country's World War II victory over Nazi Germany is considered a centerpiece of President Vladimir Putin's rule, and it usually features a dizzying display of missiles and tanks. But this was the first time since 2007 that hardware was absent. You see, Russia is in trouble. The Kremlin attributed the scaled-back parade to Ukrainian terrorist activity. Many observers suggest that the change was due to potential drone strikes from Ukraine targeting military hardware during rehearsals. This week, a Ukrainian drone hit a high-rise apartment building in Moscow, about 5 miles from Red Square, where the parade takes place. And Ukraine has been stepping up drone and missile strikes deep into Russia's territory, bringing the war back to the country that started it. Late last month, the Ukrainian drone hit a high-rise in Yekaterinburg, more than 1,000 miles from Ukraine. As Bloomberg notes, the city of 1.5 million people served as a base for industry during World War II because it was then considered too far for attacks from Europe to reach. Ukraine is also using drones to attack Russia's oil infrastructure, hoping to hurt its export revenues. As the AP reports, Ukrainian drones have hit the oil refinery and export terminal in the Black Sea city of Tuapse 4 times since April 16th. Residents reported oily drops of black rain after the attacks, and oil from the explosions has seeped into the sea. These attacks and others like them are forcing more and more Russian people far from the front lines to grapple with the reality of war. That is as the stalemate on the front line itself continues. The Institute for the Study of War reported that in April, for the first time in nearly 2 years, Russia suffered a net loss of territory in Ukraine. That means that the territory it captured was less than the territory it lost to Ukraine in April. Now, none of this means that a Russian spring and summer offensive won't happen and won't eke back gains, but it suggests the difficulty in securing an outright victory in the war. And a war with no clear end could be a threat to Putin. Walter Russell Mead wrote this week in the Wall Street Journal that an agonizing stalemate would threaten Mr. Putin's grip on power and the future of Russia itself. The Financial Times reports that Putin's approval ratings have fallen to their lowest level since he announced a partial mobilization of reservists in September of 2022. European intelligence leaked to CNN and other outlets this month reveals that security around Putin has dramatically increased amid fears of a potential assassination attempt or coup coming from Russia's dissatisfied political elite. The report says that aides close to Putin have had surveillance systems installed in their homes. His cooks, bodyguards, and photographers are forbidden from using public transport. Staffers working with him can only use phones without the internet, and he spends much of his time in underground bunkers. These measures come amid a wave of assassinations of high-level Russian military and security figures. In December, a senior Russian general was killed by a car bomb, presumably by Ukrainian agents. The FT reports that Putin's security fears have caused the Russian government to crack down on mobile internet in recent months. Rolling mobile internet outages and blocks on social media apps and VPNs may also be aimed at silencing dissent. But if that's the aim, the measures appear to be backfiring. Several Russian bloggers and influencers have criticized the Russian government for the crackdowns. One based in Monaco addressed Putin in a video last month viewed by about 32 million people. She said, "The people are afraid of you." In an essay in this week's Economist, an anonymous former senior Russian official wrote, "For the first time since the conflict began, Russians are starting to imagine a future without Putin." People are also reeling from economic woes. While Putin's Russia has benefited from rising oil prices amid the U.S. war in Iran, it's also dealing with bruising labor shortages. As Ukrainian-born Alexander Kolyander writes in The Spectator, though Putin touts Russia's 2.1 unemployment rate as a sign of a booming economy, It's really a sign that the country is running out of workers. Military conscription doesn't help, but the real culprit is long-standing demographic decline. Of course, Vladimir Putin has time and again proven to be a wily and resilient leader. But it is becoming clearer and clearer that his aggression against Ukraine has cost his country dearly.
Joining us now is CNN contributor Jill Dougherty, former CNN Moscow bureau chief and adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Thank you so much for being with me, Jill. I'll get straight to it. Putin says the war may be coming to an end, while the Trump administration says talks are in fact stalled. Is this a real diplomatic opening or mostly just strategic messaging from both sides right now?
You know, there's a lot of confusion, even in terms of any predictions. I mean, you do have to look at what President Trump said, and he said, hopefully this, temporary ceasefire is the beginning of the end. But I think accent on the word hopefully. And then, as you pointed out, Secretary Rubio said things are stalled. And then if you look at what Putin said, I always like to check the bottom line and the fine print. And what he's saying is, yes, things could be coming to an end, but he's saying, when he even said, I would be willing to sit down with Volodymyr Zelensky in a third country, but not to negotiate, to sign something that already is negotiated. So in other words, the likelihood of that happening very soon is not very great. So I think at this point, things are stalled. And the question is, can they somehow pull this out and get to some type of agreement, which is a big if.
It's very interesting. Check the small print. Both Russia and Ukraine do accuse each other of violating the Victory Day ceasefire. Was this truce ever really meant to advance negotiations, do you think? Could it hold longer?
You know, I think it was really a temporary measure at a very delicate moment. I mean, that parade was symbolic in so many ways, especially to Vladimir Putin. And to have, drone attacks by Ukrainians on Moscow would be an utter disaster. So I don't think, really, President Trump, certainly, who apparently asked both sides, he says, to have some type of, ceasefire, that it was a request simply to make sure this did not turn into a disaster. But in terms of long term, no. Immediately, both sides were accusing each other of violating. And in fact, today, I think the Russians were saying that Ukraine violated it 16,000 times. So that's kind of where we are at this point. Again, it didn't really solve much of anything, although you do have to say, Ben, that the fact that they are going to trade prisoners is a very good thing. That would be 1,000 on each side, and that's important.
Ukraine's drone strikes are reaching deeper into Russia, as you kind of alluded to there, and forcing tighter security around Moscow. How significant is that psychologically for both the Kremlin and for ordinary Russians?
I think it's very important. I mean, if you look at some of the polling, and again, it's very difficult to do polling in the middle of a war, and especially in Russia. But, indications are that Russians really are becoming very frustrated by the war. It's been going on for a long time. There is a lot of inflation. There are economic problems. People are there are reports of Russians being psychologically affected by this, depressed and worried about it. And then I think the biggest factor is shutting down the internet in Moscow, which was a very big deal. And a lot of Russians were very frustrated. They tried to go online. At points, they couldn't even get online. And that's an indication of something that I think is pretty deep, this frustration that, yes, the Kremlin is saying we need this for security, but some Russians are saying, no, it goes far beyond that. It's the Kremlin trying to control everything. So this is kind of, I'd say, a growing theme. It doesn't mean that this is going to be a revolution or anything like that, but there is discontent growing, and it's among a lot of different people.
Let's talk a bit more about those Victory Day celebrations, because they were noticeably scaled back this year. Less military hardware on display, and even reports about Putin potentially wanting Trump to help prevent strikes on Moscow. What does all of this actually mean?
You know, it was used by both sides, I think, again, in a psychological war. The Ukrainians essentially were saying, look, Vladimir Putin, because he was so afraid that Ukrainians would attack Moscow with drones, that he had to run to President Trump and ask for his help to intercede with Zelensky. Please don't fire. Now, the truth, I think, lies in the middle, that President Trump decided to ask both sides. But however that shook out, both sides were using it. So the Ukrainians, again, showing Putin as weak and scared. And then President Putin said, in a news conference after the May 9th, he said, well, security was one thing, very important to us, but also we were definitely, if there was anything coming from Ukraine, we were bound to reply. And in other words, we would fire back, and they would hit Kyiv. And so he said, I told the Chinese, I told the Indians, and I told the Americans that, you know, there are a lot of diplomats who work in Kyiv, and it would be dangerous for them. So in other words, Putin was trying to use it to say, no, I'm not scared. I was actually threatening these countries with the possibility of what could happen in Ukraine. So again, you know, the war, it's very kinetic, as that word is used so much. It's very bloody and very cruel. But there's also this psychological part of it, which is really, really important, especially in the context of what we were just talking about, the vulnerability that Putin has somewhat at home, because the discontent at home.
There's a lot going on. I'm just glad we're still talking about it, to be honest. And Jill, as always, we love your insights in there. So thank you so much, Jill Dougherty.